A defiant French president vows to intensify airstrikes on ISIL targets following the Paris attacks. But will the air war play into the hands of the Syrian President Bashar al-Assad and help keep him in power? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the programme. I'm Nick Clark. As the people of France continue to come to terms with the attacks in Paris, their leaders aren't holding back. President François Hollande is vowing to intensify airstrikes against ISIL, which has claimed responsibility for the coordinated attacks that killed 129 people and injured hundreds more. French Air Force bombers have pounded ISIL's stronghold of Raqqa in Syria for a second successive night. Let's get the latest now from Al Jazeera's Jonah Hull.
Well, for a second night now, overnight on Monday, we are told that French warplanes were in action in the skies over Raqqa in Syria. 10 jets, Rafales, Mirage, dropping 16 bombs in all on targets, ISIL targets, of course, in that stronghold city in Syria, destroying, we are told, a headquarters building and a training centre. Of course, we are not in a position to verify what actually happened on the ground or indeed to report on any casualties that may have occurred. But a second night, they began, of course, on Sunday night doing similar things. This all part of President François Hollande's promised strategy to continue to hit ISIL in Syria, quote, without mercy. And of course, in town in Paris this morning, the Secretary of State, John Kerry, will have spoken to President Hollande. President Hollande will go on to meet the Qatari Emir later. And indeed, the President has said that in the coming days, he will speak directly to Presidents Obama and Putin. And all of these conversations part now of an earnest effort led by the French President to try and build what he described as a grand coalition to wipe out ISIL on the ground. The difficulty that he will have, of course, is that he's somehow got to reconcile very serious differences between the Americans and the Russians, between the Saudis and the Gulf states and Iran. These are disparate actors in a very complicated drama, not to mention the regional neighbours as well. It will not be easy, but the effort is underway. President François Hollande determined to lead the way.
So the question now is, as the world's attention shifts from Bashar al-Assad to ISIL, does this take the pressure off the Syrian regime? Does this renewed effort to take down ISIL work in the hands of the Syrian president? And indeed, do Western governments now need Bashar al-Assad? To discuss this some more, we're joined by Lydia Wilson, who's in London, Research Fellow at the Centre for Resolution of Intractable Conflict at Oxford University. Welcome, Lydia. In Dubai, Oubai Shahbandar, who's Director for Orient Media and former US Department of Defense Middle East analyst. Also in London, Ammar Waqqaf, who's founder and director of Gnosos, an organisation that aims to express the lesser-known views from Syria and the Middle East. Welcome to you all to this important subject. Lydia, if I may start with you. In London, President François Hollande saying that the Islamic State is now his country's biggest enemy, not the Syrian President Bashar al-Assad. Does that play into Assad's hands, do you think?
Assad's hands and ISIS's hands, I would say. I think that it depends what kind of time frame you're talking about, because I think that with concerted effort, with a coalition, there could be a great weakening, if not outright domination over ISIS in the near future. But what about long term? I think there cannot possibly be any sort of solution in terms of the Islamic State without some sort of solution concerning Assad. Right.
So you would suggest a different tack, I presume?
Yes, for a long-term solution, I think that we have to get back to dealing with Syria as a whole country and the region as a whole region, and not in these isolated bits and pieces.
OK, well, we'll explore that a little bit later. Let's bring in Oubai Shahbandar in Dubai. What's your sense? Is Assad smiling at this latest development?
Well, President François Hollande has promised to strike at ISIS without mercy, but the reality is that we cannot take our eyes off Bashar al-Assad. There is a significant narrative here that focuses on the fight against ISIS first and foremost, but the reality is that we have to view the fight against Assad, which is being led by Sunni rebels on the ground, as part and parcel as the overall fight against extremists. Militarily speaking, can the West partner with Bashar al-Assad to fight ISIS effectively? The short answer to that is no, when overwhelmingly Bashar al-Assad's barrel bombs are being focused against the civilian populace in Syria. So Bashar al-Assad right now does seem to have dodged a bullet, as it were, but militarily speaking, if you are to prosecute an effective and a sustainable success against ISIS, Western military powers, both France and the United States, must relook at military options to weaken Bashar al-Assad's military war machine that continues to fuel the extremism that allows ISIS to operate in Syria today.
All right, but as it stands, Oubai, would you say that President Assad's position is stronger while the forces of the coalition seem to be so focused on ISIL?
Well, I would not say that Bashar al-Assad's position has strengthened in any shape, way, or form. Interestingly enough, the Russian airstrikes have only marginally improved Bashar al-Assad's military position in the field in Syria today. Because let's not forget that Bashar al-Assad is fighting against Sunni rebel forces that are also actually taking the lead in fighting ISIS. It's not just an issue of Bashar al-Assad. So Assad's diplomatic initiative here to the West certainly seems to be focusing on the narrative that you need to work with this regime to fight ISIS. But the reality is the West does have other options in Syria to fight and defeat ISIS, and that option is partnering with Sunni rebel forces on the ground and with Kurdish fighters.
Okay, Ammar, Waqqaf, if we could bring you in London. Certainly the focus is on ISIL right now. World leaders at the G20 issuing this joint statement calling to make the fight against ISIL the major priority. What's your sense about how the Assad regime will view this latest development?
Well, if I could bring you to a wider picture, which is the point of view of the many Syrians who actually decided that this so-called revolution isn't the very best thing in the world, they are now having this feeling of the I told you so. And everyone is saying now the West, now the world is starting to understand the fears that we had since the very first day of this crisis, which prevented us from seeking regime change. And in a sense, their fears, their point of view has been vindicated by the latest attacks. And the way they see it is that the reason for them to back the government, back the institutions of the government, or the state, to be more specific, whether they like the political regime, whether they like corruption or not, in order to have to mount the best line of defense against these perceived dangers, on top of which obviously is Islamic extremism, have been vindicated, and they look forward to having more partners now from the international community.
Oubai, Shahbandar, I can't let you perpetually shake your head. You'll have to come in.
Absolutely. Look, we need to look at the genesis for ISIS in Syria, and the reality is that the Assad's security services, specifically Syrian military intelligence, since 2005 has had a direct hand in fostering the forces that eventually became ISIS. Let's not forget, since 2005, Assad's security forces allowed al-Qaeda in Iraq free reign to operate in a safe haven in eastern Syria to launch suicide attacks into Iraq against civilians and against military forces there. And let's not forget that it was Bashar al-Assad's security services that released many of these fighters that eventually became from prison, that eventually became to form the core of ISIS. So the notion that the West has a willing and capable partner with Assad is absolutely a fallacy. And the fact that the Assad regime dares to tell the West, we told you so, is incredibly disingenuous, given that Bashar al-Assad's lieutenants have had a direct and indirect role in fostering ISIS's rise in Syria today.
Lydia Wilson, would you like to take that on?
Yeah, I've got a lot to add to that. I agree as far as it went, but there's even more to it. For a start, how about the 95% of Syrians who have actually, of the 95% who have died, it's been at Assad's hands. The Islamic State is not the major threat to Syrians right now. The threat to their lives is coming from the regime. And in terms of Assad creating ISIS, both directly and indirectly, we have to remember that in the summer of 2011, Assad released some extremist jihadists from his prisons in order to create a force that would, which would help him fight his enemies, the more moderate rebels, a strategy that worked very, very well. And then indirectly, he's created the situation through his indiscriminate use of force that has allowed ISIS to flourish. And he has been targeting ISIS's own enemies. These other rebel groups have been cleared out of the way by Assad's forces many, many times. So the idea that ISIS is saying, I'm sorry, the Syrians are saying, I told you so, I'm not really sure where that's coming from.
Ammar, Waqqaf, it's certainly true that these prison releases certainly boosted the ranks of ISIL, didn't they?
Well, in a sense, if we're talking about President Assad doing all the wonders of the world, then we're trying to topple him, really. I mean, if he's so powerful, why try in the first place? I would say, just like Tony Blair said, just like John Kerry said, probably or indicated, that destabilization of countries in the Middle East, Iraq, Syria, Libya, is what created a vacuum that is being filled by radical ideas. If I could speak in a personal capacity, I gave a testimony to the Foreign Affairs Committee in the House of Commons the other day, in which I emphasized this very point. You know, if we continue to destabilize countries, the only thing we can get is more radicalized people.
Aleppo and Damascus and Homs and Hama is not destabilizing. Bashar al-Assad's rockets, Scud missiles, and artillery shells that are destroying schools, civic society, and hospitals is not destabilizing. I mean, come on, Ammar.
Well, with all due respect, Oubai, I mean, I've listened to you focusing.
With all due respect to the thousands and tens of thousands of Syrians that are being killed and imprisoned by the Bashar al-Assad regime and the Russian warplanes, in order for us as the West, as a humanity, to forget what is killing Syrians today and instead to blame the anti-Assad forces.
Let me bring you up to date.
All right, Oubai, you've made your point now. You've made your point. Oubai, you've made your point. Oubai, you've made your point. Let's bring Ammar. Here's your chance.
Let me bring you up to date with what is really happening on the ground here, Oubai. You're probably more focused on Mr. Assad's body language, but 2 out of 3 people who left the fighting areas in Syria, 2 out of 3 people who left the fighting areas in Syria went to the Syrian government region and fled to their government-controlled areas. In a sense, that tells you that at least 2/3 of Syrians are willing to accept the current government and work with the current government, again, whether they like it or not. To portray this as it's all Assad's fault and ignore what Saudi Arabia really wants, ignore what AKP in Turkey really wants.
Ammar, I'm going to jump in there because we're getting a bit away from the concept of the programme. We discussed these issues many times before. I mean, today what we really want to focus on is what's happening now in the light of the most recent events. And Lydia, if I can come to you, today the US Secretary of State John Kerry said a ceasefire in Syria potentially is now just weeks away. Given what's happening right now, how do you think this might change the game?
If there could possibly be a ceasefire, it could lead to better political discussions, and I think some of the breakthroughs in Vienna at the weekend were, I would say I was cautiously optimistic about them helping, because they're promising so many different sorts of Syrians a seat at the table, and we will see what kind of support Bashar al-Assad gets, I am guessing. And I don't know how likely it is, but of course a ceasefire is always a first step to brokering any sort of longer-term peace.
And Oubai, at the European Union, we've also seen something very interesting happening. France requesting aid and military assistance in accordance with Article 42.7, which has been unanimously backed by EU ministers. Now, this article has never before been used in the history of the European Union. So what are the implications of that in the fight against ISIL, given the fact that we're also talking about a ceasefire on the other hand?
Absolutely. I mean, the French are bent on striking back, and it's going to be a joint effort. In fact, the French airstrikes against Daesh's position in Raqqa was a joint effort with the United States, where the United States and NATO, one of the, if not the leading NATO ally, provided crucial targeting information for the French. So this is going to be a joint effort. What we're seeing here is Paris has essentially declared war against Daesh, which is in striking contrast to the position coming out of the Obama White House, where the United States does not necessarily view itself as in a state of war with Daesh. I mean, we just heard just the other day, right before these horrific attacks, President Obama saying that Daesh has been contained. France is certainly leaning in more forward in this fight, and I think this is going to be a very important first step where a NATO member is asking for other members of the alliance to step in and help it in what it declares to be a war.
But Oubai, isn't this war footing, as you call it, isn't it precisely what ISIL would want? They want the world to respond by, going in all guns blazing?
I think that's very interesting. We have to see the critical I think indicator here is on whether or not the West will overreact or will take the right steps. Now, Daesh definitely wants the world to believe that this is a clash between two civilizations. And I think it would be a mistake for the West to rush in invasion style like the Iraq saw scenario, which is exactly what ISIS and Daesh and other extremists want. The sound strategy here would be to take a dual approach where France and the United States and NATO allies partner with local forces on the ground and provide anti-ISIS Sunni forces and anti-ISIS Kurdish forces the necessary tools that are needed to finish the fight. So the key here, as you said, is not to fall into a trap set by ISIS, but to outflank them and to partner with willing forces on the ground.
Ammar Waqqaf, notwithstanding President Assad's position, what's your view of ISIL's situation right now, and are they trying to lure the coalition into this war footing? Can they be eliminated with airstrikes?
Totally. I think that's a very important point. We at Gnosos have identified in our weekly bulletin that this has been more of a recruitment exercise, the Paris attacks that is, by Daesh to tell wannabe extremists or those who have potential that they can actually strike at the heart of Western civilization, in a sense, and that would give them a bigger brand name than before. So, in a sense, they would want the West to blindfoldedly go into a battle, bomb all those poor Muslims, in a sense, in order to raise even more recruits. The West should probably go a little bit more sophisticated than before. We understand as well at Gnosos that France is in a peculiar situation because they are now trying to prevent the likelihood of an imminent second attack that can take place, and France probably view themselves as the most vulnerable out of the European nations, A, because they are the ones who are directly involved in bombing Daesh, and B, because they are on the continent and within the Schengen agreement. So there are a bit of vulnerabilities here, and that may take them into the Russian route or through the Russian door, which may crack a little bit the coalition that is led by the United States against Daesh. And we're yet to see the dynamics around that. So,
all right, let's throw that over to Lydia Wilson in London.
Well, I'm not sure that I followed quite all of that, but in terms of the retaliation I think you were asking about of the French on Raqqa, we have seen in the past that bombing of civilians is one surefire way for more radicalization. And if the reports are true, for example, the Washington Post reported that of a hospital, a museum and a stadium have been hit in Raqqa, then that is worrying news. And we have also seen very strongly that one theme in recruits to ISIS fighters from the West has been foreign policy of their own countries, which they perceive as very Islamophobic, as targeting Muslims because they are Muslims, that is. And so I'm wondering whether there will be a blowback there on Muslims in the West, either wanting to travel or being more convinced of ISIS's rhetoric and propaganda, because this is one of the tools they use. They say your governments are against you. And so I'm wondering if that will feed into that message. Yeah, well, we've just seen from so many cases, we might actually lose the moral high ground. For example, if we carry on bombing such facilities like hospitals, and then we're less able to criticise others for doing so.
Okay, Oubai Shahbandar, now accepting the presence of President al-Assad in any transitional government is a major compromise for many countries, isn't it? But the likes of Russia would still like to see al-Assad in power, but the fact is, though, isn't it, that without striking a consensus on Syria, there can be no move forward in defeating ISIL.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you need a political process in order to reach a position where you can finally defeat ISIS. I mean, ISIS is able to exist because it is existing in the chaos and vacuum that is largely a product of the Assad regime's war against the Syrian people. Now, we're seeing here in Vienna the start of what could potentially be a fruitful process. Nonetheless, there's a wide gulf in the Russian position and in the position of the United States, France, and the Arab allies in the region regarding Assad's future. We will see what happens. The next meeting is going to be January 1st, and indeed, this is the first time in well over a year that an international conference has been held to discuss the first steps in a peace process in Syria. But I think we have a long ways to go, and it's important that we pursue the fight against ISIS and the Assad regime on parallel grounds with a political process for a transition in Syria.
Okay, Ammar, Waqqaf, let me ask you this. Let's assume that President al-Assad does take advantage of the latest situation, perhaps in weeks and months to come, holds on to power. What would his continued presence mean for this desired caliphate of ISIL?
Well, let me first take you to the point. If Tony Blair, the former British Prime Minister, is saying clearly that the invasion of Iraq is what created ISIS, I really see no point in accusing anybody else. It is about destabilizing countries. That's what creates the likes of ISIS. Regarding your question, you need also to understand how Syrians who back the government feel. They feel that they haven't participated in this revolution for a reason, and they have fears, they have interests that need to be addressed. The position of President Assad needs to be viewed from that perspective. He is seen by those people as the guarantor to those interests and fears of that part of the population of Syrians who decided that the revolution isn't a very good thing to follow. So during a transitional process or whatever it is, if those fears are addressed, if those reservations are addressed, then we can talk about a change in the regime later on. But if not, I can assure you that President Assad is going to be there for the long haul.
Okay, Lydia, let me just give the last word to you on this. And just generally speaking, in terms of where we're at right now, as far as ISIL are concerned in the weeks and months ahead.
Well, I must pick up on that comparison of Iraq and Syria because they have been destabilised for entirely different reasons, and Assad has destabilised his own country, as Oubai said already. I just can't emphasise that enough. Iraq was destabilised in an entirely different way. In the coming weeks and months, I can only hope that a ceasefire is possible and that we can see the continuation of the Vienna talks, because there are just so many different points of view involved now, and it is, in very real senses, a proxy war that we do need everybody around the table before there can be anything durable in the future.
All right, well, we've run out of time. Do appreciate all your perspectives on this. Been very interesting talking about it. Thanks very much indeed. Thanks to all my guests in London, Lydia Wilson, in Dubai, Oubai Shahbandar, and in London, Ammar Waqqaf. Thanks very much indeed. And thank you for watching. As always, you can leave your comments on the programmes page of our website, aljazeera.com. And you can post your views on facebook.com/AJ Inside Story, or just tweet us at AJ Inside Story. Thanks for watching. From me, Nick Clark, and the rest of the team, it's bye for now.